Butcher's Crossing. Everything that has life gives sign of satisfaction, and the cattle that lie on the ground seem to have great and tranquil thoughts. These halcyons may be looked for with a little more assurance in that pure October weather which we distinguish by the name of the Indian summer. The day, immeasurably long, sleeps over the broad hills and warm wide fields. To have lived through all its sunny hours seems longevity enough. The solitary places do not seem quite lonely. At the gates of the forest, the surprised man of the world is forced to leave his city estimates of great and small, wise and foolish. The knapsack of custom falls off his back with the first step he takes into these precincts. Here is sanctity, which shames our religions, and reality, which discredits our heroes. Here we find nature to be the circumstance which dwarfs every other circumstance, and judges like a god all men that come to her. Nature, Ralph Waldo Emerson. Aye, and poets send out the sick spirit to green pastures, like lame horses turned out unshod to the turf to renew their hoofs, a sort of yarb doctors in their way. Poets have it that for sore hearts, as for sore lungs, nature is the grand cure. But who froze to death my teamster on the prairie, and who made an idiot of Peter the Will Boy? The Confidence Man, Herman Melville. Part 1. 1. The coach from Ellsworth to Butcher's Crossing was a dougherty that had been converted to carry passengers and small freight. 4 mules pulled the cart over the ridged, uneven road that descended slightly from the level prairie into Butcher's Crossing. As the small wheels of the dougherty entered and left the ruts made by heavier wagons, the canvas-covered load lashed in the center of the cart shifted. The rolled-up canvas side curtains thumped against the hickory rods that supported the lath and canvas roof, and the single passenger at the rear of the wagon braced himself by wedging his body against the narrow sideboard. One hand was spread flat against the hard, leather-covered bench, and the other grasped one of the smooth hickory poles set in iron sockets attached to the sideboards. The driver, separated from his passenger by the freight that had been piled nearly as high as the roof, shouted above the snorting of the mules and the creaking of the wagon. Butcher's Crossing, just ahead. The passenger nodded and leaned his head and shoulders out over the side of the wagon. Beyond the sweating rumps and bobbing ears of the mules, he caught a glimpse of a few bare shacks and tents set in a cluster before a taller patch of trees. He had an instantaneous impression of color, of light dun blending into gray, set off by a heavy splash of green. Then the bouncing of the wagon forced him to sit upright again. He gazed at the swaying mound of goods in front of him, blinking rapidly. He was a man in his early 20s, slightly built, with a fair skin that was beginning to redden after the day's exposure to the sun. He had removed his hat to wipe the sweat from his forehead, and had not replaced it. His light brown hair, the color of Virginia tobacco, was neatly clipped, but it lay now in damp, unevenly colored ringlets about his ears and forehead. He wore yellowish-brown nankeen trousers that were nearly new, the creases still faintly visible in the heavy cloth. He had earlier removed his brown sack coat, his vest, and his tie, but even in the breeze made by the dougherty's slow forward progress, his white linen shirt was spotted with sweat and hung limply on him. The blonde nap of a 2-day-old beard glistened with moisture. Occasionally, he rubbed his face with a soiled handkerchief, as if the stubble irritated his skin. As they neared town, the road leveled and the wagon went forward more rapidly, swaying gently from side to side, so that the young man was able to relax his grasp on the hickory pole and slump forward more easily on the hard bench. The clop of the mule's feet became steady and muffled. A cloud of dust like yellow smoke rose about the wagon and billowed behind it. Above the rattle of harness, the mules' heavy breathing, the clop of their hooves, and the uneven creaking of the wagon, could be heard now and then the distant shout of a human voice and the nickering of a horse. Along the side of the road, bare patches appeared in the long level of prairie grass. Here and there, the charred, crossed logs of an abandoned campfire were visible. A few hobbled horses grazed on the short yellow grass and raised their heads sharply, their ears pitched forward, at the sound of the wagon passing. A voice rose in anger. Someone laughed. A horse snorted and neighed, and a bridle jingled at a sudden movement. The faint odor of manure was locked in the hot air. Butcher's Crossing could be taken in almost at a glance. A group of 6 rough frame buildings was bisected by a narrow dirt street. There was a scattering of tents beyond the buildings on either side. The wagon passed, first on its left, a loosely erected tent of army drab with rolled-up sides, which held from the roof flap a flatboard crudely lettered in red, Joe Long, Barber. On the opposite side of the road was a low building, almost square, windowless, with a flap of canvas for a door. Across the bare front boards of this building were the more carefully executed letters, in black, Bradley Dry Goods. In front of the next building, a long rectangular structure of 2 stories, the Doherty stopped. From within this building came a low, continuous murmur of voices, and there could be heard the regular clink of glass on glass. The front was shaded by a long overhang of roof, but there was discernible in the shadow, over the entranceway, an ornately lettered sign, in red with black edging, which said, Jackson's Saloon. Upon a long bench in front of this place sat several men, lethargically staring at the wagon as it came to a halt. The young passenger began to gather from the seat beside him the clothing he had doffed earlier in the heat of the day. He put on his hat and his coat and stuffed the vest and cravat into the carpet-bag upon which he had been resting his feet. He lifted the carpet-bag over the sideboard into the street, and with the same motion lifted a leg over the boards and stepped onto the hanging iron plate that let him descend to the ground. When his boot struck the earth, a round puff of dust flew up, surrounding his foot. It settled on the new black leather and on the bottom of his trouser leg, making their colors nearly the same. He picked up his bag and walked under the projecting roof into the shade. Behind him, the driver's curses mingled with the clank of iron and the jingling of harness chain as he detached the rear doubletree from the wagon. The driver called plaintively, "Some of you men give me a hand with this freight." The young man who had got off the wagon stood on the rough board sidewalk, watching the driver struggle with the reins that had tangled with the harness trace. 2 of the men who had been sitting on the bench got up, brushed past him, and went slowly into the street. They contemplated the rope that secured the freight and began, unhurriedly, to tug at the knots. With a final jerk, the driver managed to unsnarl the reins. He led the mules in a long diagonal across the street toward the livery stable, a low open building with a split-log roof supported by unpeeled, upright logs. After the driver led his team into the stable, another stillness came upon the street. The 2 men were methodically loosening the ropes that held the covered freight. The sounds from inside the saloon were muffled as if by layers of dust and heat. The young man stepped forward carefully upon the odd lengths of scrap board set directly on the earth. Facing him was a half dugout with a sharply slanting roof at the near edge of which was a hinged covering, held upright by 2 diagonal poles, which let down to cover the wide front opening. Inside the dugout, on benches and shelves, were scattered a few saddles and a half-dozen or more pair of boots. Long strips of raw leather hung from a peg that jutted out of the sod wall near the opening. To the left of this small dugout was a double-storied structure, newly painted white with red trimmings, nearly as long as Jackson's Saloon and somewhat higher. In the dead center of this building was a wide door, above which was a neatly framed sign that read, Butcher's Hotel. It was toward this that the young man slowly walked, watching the street dust pushed forward in quick, dissipating jets by his moving feet. He entered the hotel and paused just beyond the open door to let his eyes become accustomed to the dimness. The vague shape of a counter rose in front of him to his right. Behind it, unmoving, stood a man in a white shirt. A half-dozen straight, leather-seated chairs were scattered about the room. Light was given from square windows set regularly in the 3 walls he could see. The squares were covered with a translucent cloth that billowed slightly inward, as if the dimness and comparative coolness were a vacuum. He went across the bare wood floor to the waiting clerk. "I would like a room." His voice echoed hollowly in the silence. The clerk pushed forward an opened ledger and handed him a steel-tipped quill. He signed slowly, "William Andrews." The ink was thin, a pale blue against the grey page. $2, the clerk said, pulling the ledger closer to him and peering at the name. 2 bits extra if you want hot water brought up. He looked up suddenly at Andrews. "Be here long?" "I'm not sure," Andrews said. "Do you know a J.D. McDonald?" "McDonald?" The clerk nodded slowly. "The Hyde man? Sure, everybody knows McDonald." "Friend of yours?" "Not exactly," Andrews said. "Do you know where I can find him?" The clerk nodded. "He has an office down by the brining pits, about a 10-minute walk from here." "I'll see him tomorrow," Andrews said. "I just got in from Ellsworth a few minutes ago, and I'm tired." The clerk closed the ledger, selected a key from a large ring that was attached to his belt, and gave the key to Andrews. "You'll have to carry your own bag up," he said. "I'll bring up the water whenever you want it." "About an hour," Andrews said. "Room 15, the clerk said. "It's just off the stairs." Andrews nodded. The stairs were unsided treads without headers that pitched sharply up from the far wall and cut into a small rectangular opening in the center level of the building. Andrews stood at the head of a narrow hall that bisected the long row of rooms. He found his own room and entered through the unlocked door. In the room, there was space only for a narrow rope bed with a thin mattress, a roughly hewn table with a lamp and a tin wash basin, a mirror, and a straight chair similar to those he had seen below in the lobby. The room had one window that faced the street. Set into it was a light, detachable wood frame covered with a gauze-like cloth. He realized that he had seen no glass windows since he had got into town. He set his carpet-bag on the bare mattress. After he had unpacked his belongings, he shoved his bag under the low bed and stretched himself out on the uneven mattress. It rustled and sank beneath his weight. He could feel the taut ropes which supported the mattress against his body. His lower back, his buttocks, and his upper legs throbbed dully. He had not realized before how tiring the journey had been. But now the journey was done, and as his muscles loosened, his mind went back over the way he had come. For nearly 2 weeks, by coach and rail, he had let himself be carried across the country, from Boston to Albany, from Albany to New York, from New York. The names of the cities jumbled in his memory, disconnected from the route he had taken. Baltimore, Philadelphia, Cincinnati, St. Louis. He remembered the grinding discomfort of the hard coach chairs and the inert waiting in grimy depots on slatted wooden benches. All the discomforts of his journey now seeped outward from his bones, brought to consciousness by his knowledge of the journey's end. He knew he would be sore tomorrow. He smiled and closed his eyes against the brightness of the covered window that he faced. He dozed. Sometime later, the clerk brought up a wooden tub and a bucket of steaming water. Andrews roused himself and scooped up some of the hot water in the tin basin. He soaped his face and shaved. The clerk returned with 2 more buckets of cold water and poured them in the tub. When he had left the room, Andrews undressed slowly, shaking the dust from his garments as he drew them off. He laid them carefully on the straight chair. He stepped into the tub and sat down, his knees drawn up to his chin. He soaped himself slowly, made drowsy by the warm water and the late afternoon quiet. He sat in the tub until his head began to nod forward. When at last it touched his knees, he straightened himself and got out of the tub. He stood on the bare floor, dripping water, and looked about the room. Finding no towel, he took his shirt off the chair and dried himself. A dimness had crept into the room. The window was a pale glow in the gathering murk, and a cool breeze made the cloth waver and billow. It appeared to throb like something alive, growing larger and smaller. From the street came the slowly rising mutter of voices and the sounds of boots clumping on the boardwalks. A woman's voice was raised in laughter, then abruptly cut off. The bath had relaxed him and eased the increasing throb of his strained back muscles. Still naked, he pushed the folded linsey-woolsey blanket into a shape like a pillow and lay down on the raw mattress. It was rough to his skin, but he was asleep before it was fully dark in his room. During the night, he was awakened several times by sounds not quite identified on the edge of his sleeping mind. During these periods of wakefulness, he looked about him and in the total darkness could not perceive the walls, the limits of his room. And he had the sensation that he was blind, suspended in nowhere, unmoving. He felt that the sounds of laughter, the voices, the subdued thumps and gratings, the jinglings of bridle bells and harness chains all proceeded from his own head and whirled around there like wind in a hollow sphere. Once he thought he heard the voice, then the laughter, of a woman very near, down the hall, in one of the rooms. He lay awake for several moments, listening intently, but he did not hear her again. 2. Andrews breakfasted at the hotel. In a narrow room at the rear of the first floor was a single long table, around which was scattered a number of the straight chairs that appeared to be the hotel's principal furniture. 3 men were at one end of the table, hunched together in conversation. Andrews sat alone at the other end. The clerk who had brought his water up the day before came into the dining room and asked Andrews if he wanted breakfast. When Andrews nodded, he turned and went toward the small kitchen behind the 3 men at the far end of the table. He walked with a small limp that was visible only from the rear. He returned with a tray that held a large plate of beans and hominy grits and a mug of steaming coffee. He put the food before Andrews and reached to the center of the table for an open dish of salt. "Where could I find McDonald this time of the morning?" Andrews asked him. "In his office," the clerk said. "He's there most of the time, day and night. Go straight down the road toward the creek and turn off to your left just before you get to the patch of cottonwoods. It's the little shack just this side of the brining pits." "The brining pits?" "For the hides," the clerk said. "You can't miss it." Andrews nodded. The clerk turned again and left the room. Andrews ate slowly. The beans were lukewarm and tasteless even with salt, and the hominy grits were mushy and barely warm through. But the coffee was hot and bitter. It numbed his tongue and made him pull his lips tight along his even white teeth. He drank it all, as swiftly as the heat would allow him. By the time he finished breakfast and went into the street, the sun had risen high above the few buildings of the town and was bearing down upon the street with an intensity that seemed almost material. There were more people about than there had been the afternoon before when he had first come into the town. A few men in dark suits with bowler hats mingled with a larger number more carelessly dressed in faded blue Levi's, soiled canvas, or broadcloth. They walked with some purpose, yet without particular hurry, upon the sidewalk and in the street. Amid the drab shades of the men's clothing, there was occasionally visible the colorful glimpse, red, lavender, pure white, of a woman's skirt or blouse. Andrews pulled the brim of his slouch hat down to shade his eyes, and walked along the street toward the clump of trees beyond the town. He passed the leather goods shop, the livery stable, and a small open-sided blacksmith shop. The town ended at that point, and he stepped off the sidewalk onto the road. About 200 yards from the town was the turnoff that the clerk had described. It was little more than twin ribbons of earth worn bare by passing wheels. At the end of this path, 100 yards or so from the road, was a small, flat-roofed shack, and beyond that a series of pole fences arranged in a pattern he could not make out at this distance. Near the fences, at odd angles, were several empty wagons, their tongues on the earth, in directions away from the fences. A vague stench that Andrews could not identify grew stronger as he came nearer the office and the fences. The shack door was open. Andrews paused, his clenched hand raised to knock. Inside the single room was a great clutter of books, papers, and ledgers scattered upon the bare wood floor and piled unevenly in the corners and spilling out of crates set against the walls. In the center of this, apparently crowded there, a man in his shirt sleeves sat hunched over a rough table, thumbing with intense haste the heavy pages of a ledger. He was cursing softly, monotonously. "Mr. McDonald," Andrews said. The man looked up, his small mouth open and his brows raised over protuberant blue eyes, whose whites were of the same shaded whiteness as his shirt. Come in, he said, thrusting his hand violently up through the thin hair that dangled over his forehead. He pushed his chair back from the table, started to get up, and then sat back wearily, his shoulders slumping. "Come on in. Don't just stand around there." Andrews entered and stood just inside the doorway. McDonald waved in the direction of a corner behind Andrews and said, "Get a chair, boy. Sit down." Andrews drew a chair from behind a stack of papers and placed it in front of McDonald's desk. "What do you want? What can I do for you?" McDonald asked. "I'm Will Andrews. I reckon you don't remember me." "Andrews?" McDonald frowned, regarding the younger man with some hostility. "Andrews." His lips tightened. The corners of his mouth went down into the lines that came up from his chin. "Don't waste my time, goddammit. If I had remembered you, I'd have said something when you first came in. Now, I have a letter," Andrews said, reaching into his breast pocket. "From my father, Benjamin Andrews. You knew him in Boston." McDonald took the letter that Andrews held in front of him. "Andrews? Boston?" His voice was querulous, distracted. His eyes were on Andrews as he opened the letter. "Why, sure. Why didn't you say you were—" "Sure, that preacher fellow." He read the letter intently, moving it about before his eyes as if that might hasten his perusal. When he had finished, he refolded the letter and let it drop onto a stack of papers on the table. He drummed his fingers on the table. My God. Boston. It must have been 12, 14 years ago. Before the war. I used to drink tea in your front parlor. He shook his head wonderingly. I must have seen you at one time or another. I don't even remember. My father has spoken of you often, Andrews said. Me? McDonald's mouth hung open again. He shook his head slowly. His round eyes seemed to swivel in their sockets. Why? I only saw him maybe half a dozen times. His gaze went beyond Andrews, and he said, without expression, I wasn't anybody for him to speak of. I was a clerk for some dry goods company. I can't even remember its name. I think my father admired you, Mr. McDonald, Andrews said. Me? He laughed shortly, then glowered suspiciously at Andrews. Listen, boy, I went to your father's church because I thought I might meet somebody that would give me a better job, and I started going to those little meetings your father had for the same reason. I never even knew what they were talking about half the time. He said bitterly, I would just nod at anything anybody said. Not that it did a damn bit of good. I think he admired you because you were the only man he ever knew who came out here, who came west and made a life for himself. McDonald shook his head. Boston, he half whispered. My God. For another moment he stared beyond Andrews. Then he lifted his shoulders and took a breath. How did old Mr. Andrews know where I was? A man from Bates and Durfee was passing through Boston. He mentioned you worked for the company in Kansas City. In Kansas City, they told me you would quit them and come here. McDonald grinned tightly. I have my own company now. I left Bates and Durfee 4 or 5 years ago. He scowled, and one hand went to the ledger he had closed when Andrews entered the shack. Do it all myself now. Well, he straightened again. The letter says I should help you any way I can. What made you come out here anyway? Andrews got up from the chair and walked aimlessly about the room, looking at the piles of papers. McDonald grinned, his voice lowered. Trouble? Did you get in some kind of trouble back home? No, Andrews said quickly. Nothing like that. Lots of boys do, McDonald said. That's why they come out here. Even a preacher's son. My father is a lay minister in the Unitarian Church, Andrews said. It's the same thing. McDonald waved his hand impatiently. Well, you want a job? Hell, you can have a job with me. God knows I can't keep up. Look at all this stuff. He pointed to the stacked papers. His finger was trembling. I'm 2 months behind now and getting further behind all the time. Can't find anybody around here to sit still long enough to... Mr. McDonald, Andrew said, I know nothing about your business. What? You don't what? Why, it's hides, boy. Buffalo hides. I buy and sell. I send out parties. They bring in the hides. I sell them in St. Louis. Do my own curing and tanning right here. Handled almost 100,000 hides last year. This year, twice, 3 times that much. Great opportunity, boy. Think you could handle some of this paperwork? Mr. McDonald, this paperwork is what gets me down. He ran his fingers through the thin black strands of hair that fell about his ears. I'm grateful, sir, Andrew said, but I'm not sure. Well, it's only a start. Look. With a thin hand like a claw, he grasped Andrew's arm above the elbow and pushed him toward the doorway. Look out there. They went into the hot sunlight. Andrew squinted and winced against the brightness. MacDonald, still clutching at his arm, pointed toward the town. A year ago, when I came here, there were 3 tents and a dugout over there. A saloon, a whorehouse, a dry goods store, and a blacksmith. Look at it now. He pushed his face up to Andrew's and said in a hoarse whisper, his breath sweet sour from tobacco, Keep this to yourself, but this town's going to be something 2-3 years from now. I've got 6 lots staked out already, and the next time I get to Kansas City, I'm going to stake out that many more. It's wide open. He shook Andrew's arm as if it were a stick. He lowered his voice, which had grown strident. Look, boy, it's the railroad. Don't go talking this around, but when the railroad comes through here, this is going to be a town. You come in with me. I'll steer you right. Anybody can stake out a claim for the land around here. All you have to do is sign your name to a piece of paper at the state land office. Then you sit back and wait. That's all. Thank you, sir, Andrew said. I'll consider it. Consider it. MacDonald released his arm and stepped back from him in astonishment. He threw up his hands and they fluttered as he walked around once in a tight, angry little circle. Consider it? Why, boy, it's an opportunity. Listen, what were you doing back in Boston before you came out here? I was in my 3rd year at Harvard College. You see, MacDonald said triumphantly. And what would you have done with your 4th year? You'd have gone to work for somebody, or you'd have been a school teacher like old Mr. Andrews, or, listen, there ain't many like us out here, men with vision, men who can think to tomorrow. He pointed a shaking hand toward the town. Do you see those people back there? Did you talk to any of them? No, sir, Andrew said. I only got in from Ellsworth yesterday afternoon. Hunters, MacDonald said. His thin, dry lips went loose and open as if he had tasted something rotten. All hunters and hard cases. That's what this country would be if it wasn't for men like us. People just living off the land, not knowing what to do with it. Are they mostly hunters in town? Hunters, hard cases, a few eastern loafers. This is a hide town, boy. It'll change. Wait till the railroad comes through. I think I'd like to talk to some of them, Andrews said. Who? MacDonald shouted. Hunters? Oh, my God. Don't tell me you're like the other young'uns that come in here. 3 years at Harvard College, and you want to use it that way. I ought to have known it. I ought to have known it when you first came. I just want to talk to some of them, Andrew said. Sure, MacDonald said bitterly. And the first thing you know, you'll be wanting to go out. His voice became earnest. Listen, boy, listen to me. You start going out with those men, it'll ruin you. Oh, I've seen it. It gets in you like buffalo lice. You won't care anymore. Those men... Andrews clawed in the air as if for a word. Mr. MacDonald, Andrews said quietly, I appreciate what you're trying to do for me, but I want to try to explain something to you. I came out here... He paused and let his gaze go past MacDonald, away from the town, beyond the ridge of earth that he imagined was the riverbank, to the flat yellowish-green land that faded into the horizon westward. He tried to shape in his mind what he had to say to MacDonald. It was a feeling, it was an urge that he had to speak. but whatever he spoke he knew would be but another name for the wildness that he sought. It was a freedom and a goodness, a hope and a vigor that he perceived to underlie all the familiar things of his life, which were not free or good or hopeful or vigorous. What he sought was the source and preserver of his world, a world which seemed to turn ever in fear away from its source rather than search it out, as the prairie grass around him sent down its fibered roots into the rich, dark dampness, the wildness, and thereby renewed itself year after year. Suddenly, in the midst of the great flat prairie, unpeopled and mysterious, there came into his mind the image of a Boston street crowded with carriages and walking men who toiled sluggishly beneath the arches of evenly spaced elms that had been made to grow, it seemed, out of the flat stone of sidewalk and roadway. There came into his mind the image of tall buildings, packed side by side, the ornately cut stone of which was grime by smoke and city filth. There came into his mind the image of the River Charles winding among plotted fields and villages and towns, carrying the refuse of man and city out to the great bay. He became aware that his hands were tightly clenched. The tips of his fingers slipped in the moisture of his palms. He loosened his fists and wiped his palms on his trousers. I came out here to see as much of the country as I can, he said quietly. I want to get to know it. It's something that I have to do. Young folks, said MacDonald. He spoke softly. Flat lines of sweat ran through the glinting beads of moisture that stood out on his forehead and ran into his tangled eyebrows, which were lowered over the eyes that regarded Andrew steadily. They don't know what to do with themselves. My God, if you'd start now, if you had the sense to start now, by the time you're 40, you could be... He shrugged. Let's get back out of the sun. They re-entered the dim little shack. Andrews discovered that he was breathing heavily. His shirt was soaked with perspiration, and it clung to his skin and slid unpleasantly over it as he moved. He removed his coat and sank into the chair before MacDonald's table. He felt a curious weakness and lassitude descend from his chest and shoulders to his fingertips. A long silence fell upon the room. MacDonald's hand rested on his ledger. One finger moved aimlessly above the page, but did not touch it. At last he sighed deeply and said, "All right, go and talk to them, but I'll warn you, most of the men around here hunt for me. You're not going to have an easy time getting into a party without my help. Don't try to hook up with any of the men I send out. You leave my men alone. I won't be responsible. I won't have you on my conscience." "I'm not even sure I want to go on a hunt," Andrew said sleepily. "I just want to talk to the men that do." "Trash," MacDonald muttered. "You come out here all the way from Boston, Massachusetts, just to get mixed up with trash." "Who should I talk to, Mr. MacDonald?" Andrews asked. "What?" "Who should I talk to?" Andrews repeated. "I ought to talk to someone who knows his business, and you told me to keep away from your men." MacDonald shook his head. "You don't listen to a word a man says, do you? You got it all figured out." "No, sir," Andrew said. "I don't have anything figured out. I just want to know more about this country." "All right," MacDonald said tiredly. He closed the ledger that he had been fingering and tossed it on a pile of papers. "You talk to Miller. He's a hunter, but he ain't as bad as the rest of them. He's been out here most of his life. At least, he ain't as bad as the rebels and the hard Yankees. Maybe he'll talk to you. Maybe he won't. You'll have to find out for yourself." "Miller?" Andrews asked. "Miller," MacDonald said. "He lives in a dugout down by the river, but you'll more likely find him in Jackson's. That's where they all hang out, day and night. Ask anybody. Everybody knows Miller." "Thank you, Mr. MacDonald," Andrew said. "I appreciate your help." "Don't thank me," MacDonald said. "I'm doing nothing for you. I'm giving you a man's name." Andrews rose. The weakness had gone into his legs. It is the heat, he thought, and the strangeness. He stood still for a moment, gathering his strength. "One thing," MacDonald said, "just one thing I ask you." He appeared to Andrews to recede into the dimness. "Of course, Mr. MacDonald, what is it?" Let me know before you go out, if you decide to go. Just come back here and let me know." "Of course," Andrew said. "I'll be seeing you often, I hope. It's just that I want to have a little more time before I decide anything." "Sure," McDonald said bitterly. "Take all the time you can. You got plenty." "Goodbye, Mr. McDonald." McDonald waved his hand angrily and turned his attention abruptly to the papers on his desk. Andrews walked slowly out of the shack, into the yard, and turned on the wagon trail that led to the main road. At the main road, he paused. Across from him, and some yards to his left, was the clump of cottonwoods. Beyond that, intersecting the road, must be the river. He could not see the water, but he could see the humped banks clustered with low-growing shrub and weed winding off into the distance. He turned and went back toward the town. It was near noon when he arrived at the hotel. The tiredness that had come upon him in McDonald's shack remained. In the hotel dining room he ate lightly of tough fried meat and boiled beans and sipped bitter hot coffee. The hotel clerk, who limped in and out of the dining room, asked him if he had found McDonald. He replied that he had. The clerk nodded and said nothing more. Soon Andrews left the dining room, went up to his room, and lay on his bed. He watched the cloth screen at his window billow softly inward until he was asleep. 3. When he awoke, his room was dark. The cloth screen at his window let in a flickering brightness from the street below. He heard distant shouts beneath the querulous murmur of many voices, and the snorting of a horse, and the clop of hooves. For a moment he could not remember where he was. He got up abruptly and sat on the edge of his bed. The mattress rustled beneath him. He relaxed and ran his fingers through his hair, down over the back of his head and neck, and stretched his head backward, welcoming the soreness that warmed pleasantly up between his shoulder blades. In the darkness he walked across his room to the small table, which was outlined dimly beside the window. He found a match on the table and lit the lamp beside the wash basin. In the mirror his face was a sharp contrast of yellow brightness and dark shadow. He put his hands in the lukewarm water of the basin and rinsed his face. He dried his hands and face on the same shirt he had used the day before. By the flickering light of the lamp, he put on his black string tie and brown sack coat, which was beginning to smell of his own sweat, and stared at himself in the mirror as if he were a stranger. Then he blew the lamp out and made his way out of the room. The street lay in long shadows cast by the yellow lights that came from the open doors and windows of the few buildings of Butcher's Crossing. A lone light came from the dry goods store opposite the hotel. Bulky figures moved about it, their sizes exaggerated by the shadows. More light, and the sound of laughter and heavily clumping feet came from the saloon next to it. A few horses were tethered to the roughly hewn hitching rail set out 8 or 10 feet from the sidewalk in front of Jackson's. They were motionless, but the moving lights glinted on their eyeballs and on the smooth hair of their flanks. Up the street, beyond the dugout, 2 lanterns hung on logs in front of the livery stable. Just beyond the livery stable, a dull red glow came from the blacksmith shop, and there could be heard the heavy clank of hammer upon iron and the angry hissing as hot metal was thrust into water. Andrews went in a slow diagonal across the street toward Jackson's. The room he entered was long and narrow. Its length extended at a right angle from the street, and its width was such that 4 men could not stand with comfort shoulder to shoulder across it. 6 lanterns hung from unpainted, sooty rafters. The light they gave was reflected sharply downward, so that the surface of everything in the room glinted with yellow light, and everything beneath those surfaces fell into vague shadows. Andrews walked forward. To his right, a long bar extended nearly the length of the room. The bar top was 2 thick-hewn planks placed side by side and supported by unfinished split logs set directly on the unevenly planked floor. He breathed deeply, and the sharp mingled odor of burning kerosene, sweat, and liquor gathered in his lungs. He coughed. He went to the bar, which was only a little higher than his waist. The bartender, a short, bald man with large mustaches and a yellow skin, looked at him without speaking. "A beer," Andrews said. The bartender drew a heavy mug from beneath the bar and turned to one of several kegs that stood on large wooden boxes. He turned a spigot and let the beer slide in white bubbles down the side of the mug. Setting the mug before Andrews, he said, "That'll be 2 bits." Andrews tasted the beer. It seemed warmer than the room, and its flavor was thin. He laid a coin on the table. "I'm looking for a Mr. Miller," he said. "I was told I might find him here." "Miller?" The bartender turned indifferently and looked at the far end of the room where, in the shadows, there were 2 small tables about which were seated 6 men drinking quietly. "Don't seem to be in here. You a friend of his?" "I've never met him," Andrew said. "I want to see him on a matter of business. Mr. McDonald said that I would probably find him here." The bartender nodded. "You might find him in the big room." He indicated with his eyes a point behind Andrews. Andrews turned and saw that there was a closed door that must lead to another room. "He's a big man, clean-shaved. Probably be sitting with Charlie Hoge. Little feller, grey-haired." Andrews thanked the bartender, finished his beer, and went through the door on the narrow side of the saloon. The room he entered was large and more dimly lighted than the one he had left. Though many lanterns hung from hooks on the smoked rafters, only a few were lighted. The room lay in pools of light and larger, irregular spaces of shadow. Rudely shaped tables were arranged so that there was an empty oval space in the center of the room. At the back, a straight staircase led up to the second floor. Andrews walked forward, opening his eyes wide against the dimness. At one of the tables sat 5 men playing cards. They did not look up at Andrews, nor did they speak among themselves. The slap of cards and the tiny click of poker chips came upon the quietness. At another table sat 2 girls, their heads close together, murmuring. A man and a woman were seated together nearby. A few other groups were gathered at shadowed tables elsewhere in the large room. There was a quiet, slow fluidity to the scene which was strange to Andrews, and it absorbed him so that for a moment he did not remember why he had come here. At the far end of the room, through the dimness and the smoke, he saw seated at a table 2 men and a woman. They were somewhat apart from the others, and the larger of the men was looking directly at him. Andrews moved across the open space toward them. When he stood before their table, all 3 of them were looking up at him. The 4 remained for several moments unmoving and silent. Andrew's attention was on the large man directly in front of him, but he was aware of the girl's rather pale, plump face and yellow hair that seemed to flow from round bare shoulders, and of the smaller man's long nose and grey stubbled face. "Mr. Miller?" Andrews asked. The large man nodded. "I'm Miller," he said. His pupils were black and sharply distinct from the whites, and his brows were set closely above them in a frown that wrinkled the broad bridge of his nose. His skin was slightly yellowed and smooth like cured leather, and at the corners of his wide mouth deep ridges curved up to the thick base of his nose. His hair was heavy and black. It was parted at the side and lay in thick ropes over half his ears. He said again, "I'm Miller." "My name is Will Andrews. My family are old friends of J.D. McDonald. Mr. McDonald said you might be willing to talk to me." "McDonald?" Miller's heavy, almost hairless lids came down over his eyes in a slow blink. "Sit down, son." Andrews sat in the empty chair between the girl and Miller. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "What does McDonald want?" Miller asked. "I beg your pardon?" "McDonald sent you over here, didn't he? What does he want?" "No, sir," Andrews said. "You don't understand. I just wanted to talk with someone who knew this country. Mr. McDonald was kind enough to give me your name." Miller looked at him steadily for a moment and then nodded. "McDonald's been trying to get me to head a party for him for 2 years now. I thought he was trying again." "No, sir," Andrews said. "You work for McDonald?" "No, sir," Andrews said. "He offered me a job, but I turned it down." "Why?" Miller asked. Andrews hesitated. "I didn't want to be tied down. I didn't come out here for that." Miller nodded and shifted his bulk. Andrews realized that the man beside him had been motionless until this moment. This here is Charlie Hoge, Miller said, moving his head slightly in the direction of the grey man who sat opposite Andrews. I'm pleased to meet you, Mr. Hoge, Andrews said, and put his hand across the table. Hoge was grinning at him crookedly, his sharp face sunk down beneath narrow shoulder blades. He slowly raised his right arm and suddenly thrust his forearm across the table. The arm ended at the wrist in a white nub that was neatly puckered and scarred. Involuntarily, Andrews drew his own hand back. Hoge laughed. His laughter was an almost soundless wheeze that seemed forced from his thin chest. Don't mind Charlie, son, Miller said. He always does that. It's his idea of fun. Lasted in the winter of '62, Charlie Hoge said, still gasping with his laughter. It froze and would have dropped clean off if... He shivered suddenly and continued to shiver as if he felt the cold again. You might buy Charlie a drink of whiskey, Mr. Andrews, Miller said, almost gently. That's another one of his ideas of fun. Of course, Andrews said. He half rose from his chair. Shall I? Never mind, Miller said. Francine will get the drinks. He nodded at the blonde girl. This is Francine. Andrews was still half raised above the table. How do you do? He said, and bowed slightly. The girl smiled, her pale lips parting over teeth that were very white and slightly irregular. Sure, Francine said. Does anybody else want something? She spoke slowly and with the trace of a Germanic accent. Miller shook his head. A glass of beer, Andrew said. And if you would like something? No, Francine said. I'm not working now. She got up and moved away from the table. For a few moments, Andrew's eyes followed her. She was heavy, but she moved with grace across the room. She wore a dress of some shiny material with broad white and blue stripes. The bodice was tight, and it pushed the fullness of her flesh upward. Andrew turned questioningly toward Miller as he sat down. Does she work here? Andrews asked. Francine? Miller looked at him without expression. Francine is a whore. There are 9, 10 of them in town. 6 of them work here, and there are a couple of Indians that work the dugouts down by the river. A scarlet woman, Charlie Hoge said. He was still shivering. A woman of sin. He did not smile. Charlie is a Bible man, Miller said. He can read it pretty good. A whore, Andrew said and swallowed. He smiled. Somehow she doesn't look like... The corners of Miller's wide mouth lifted slightly. Where'd you say you was from, son? Boston, he said. Boston, Massachusetts. Ain't they got whores in Boston, Massachusetts? Andrew's face warmed. I suppose so, he said. I suppose so, he said again. Yes. Miller nodded. They got whores in Boston. But a whore in Boston and a whore in Butcher's Crossing, now, there's 2 different things. I see, Andrews said. I don't reckon you do, Miller said. But you will. In Butcher's Crossing, a whore is a necessary part of the economy. A man's got to have something besides liquor and food to spend his money on, and something to bring him back to town after he's been out in the country. In Butcher's Crossing, a whore can pick and choose and still make a right smart amount of money, and that makes her almost respectable. Some of them even get married. Make right good wives, I hear, for them that want wives. Andrews did not speak. Miller leaned back in his chair. Besides, this is a slack time, and Francine ain't working. When a whore ain't working, I guess she looks just about like anybody else. Sin and corruption, Charlie Hoge said. She's got the taint within her. With his good hand, he grasped the edge of the table so tightly that the knuckles showed blue-white against the brown of his skin. Francine returned to the table with their drinks. She leaned over Andrew's shoulder to set Charlie Hoge's glass of whiskey before him. Andrews was aware of her warmth, her smell. He shifted. She put his beer before him and smiled. Her eyes were pale and large, and her reddish-blonde lashes, soft as down, made her eyes appear wide and unblinking. Andrews took some coins from his pocket and put them in her palm. Do you want me to leave? Francine asked Miller. Sit down, Miller said. Mr. Andrews just wants to talk. The sight of the whiskey had calmed Charlie Hodge. He took the glass in his hand and drank rapidly, his head thrown back and his Adam's apple running like a small animal beneath the grey fur of his bearded throat. When he finished the drink, he hunched himself back in his chair and remained still, watching the others with cold little grey eyes. "What did you want to talk about, Mr. Andrews?" Miller asked. Andrews looked uncomfortably at Francine and Charlie Hodge. He smiled. "You put it kind of abruptly," he said. Miller nodded. "I figured to." Andrews paused and said, "I guess I just want to know the country. I've never been out here before. I want to know as much as I can." "What for?" Miller asked. Andrews looked at him blankly. "You talk like you're an educated man, Mr. Andrews." "Yes, sir," he said. "I was 3 years at Harvard College." "Well," Miller said, 3 years, that's quite a spell. How long you been away from there?" "Not long. I left to come out here." Miller looked at him for a moment. Harvard College. He shook his head. "I learned myself to read one winter. I was snowed in a trapper's shack in Colorado. I can write my name on paper. What do you think you can learn from me?" Andrews frowned and suppressed a tone of annoyance he felt creep into his voice. "I don't even know you, Mr. Miller," he said with a little heat. "It's like I said, I want to know something about this country. Mr. McDonald said you were a good man to talk to, that you knew as much about this country as any man around. I had hoped that you would be kind enough to converse with me for an hour or so, to acquaint me with—" Miller shook his head again and grinned. "You sure talk easy, son. You do, for a fact. That what you learned to do at Harvard College?" For a moment, Andrews stared at him stiffly. Then he smiled. "No, sir, I reckon not. At Harvard College, you don't talk, you just listen." "Sure, now," Miller said. "That's reason enough for any man to leave. A boy's got to speak up for himself once in a while." "Yes, sir," Andrews said. "So you came out here to Butcher's Crossing?" "Yes, sir." "And when you learn what you want to learn, what'll you do? Go back and brag to your kinfolk? Write something for the papers?" "No, sir," Andrews said. "It's not for any of those reasons. It's for myself." Miller did not speak for several moments. Then he said, "You might buy Charlie another glass of whiskey, and I'll have a glass myself this time." Francine rose. She spoke to Andrews. "Another beer?" "Whiskey," Andrews said. After Francine left their table, Andrews was silent for some time. He did not look at either of the two men at the table with him. Miller said, "So you didn't tie up with McDonald?" "It wasn't what I wanted." Miller nodded. "This is a hunt town, boy. If you stay around, there ain't much choice about what you do. You can take a job with McDonald and make yourself some money, or you can start yourself some kind of little business and hope that the railroad does come through, or you can tie up with a party and hunt buffalo." That's about what Mr. McDonald said. "And he didn't like the last idea." Andrew smiled. "No, sir." "He don't like hunters," Miller said. "And they don't like him either." "Why?" Miller shrugged. "They do the work, and he gets all the money. They think he's a crook, and he thinks they're fools. You can't blame either side. They're both right." Andrew said, "But you're a hunter yourself, aren't you, Mr. Miller?" Miller shook his head. "Not like these around here, and not for McDonald. He outfits his own parties and gives them 50 cents a head for raw hides. Summer hides, not much more than thin leather. He has 30 or 40 parties out all the time. He gets plenty of skins, but the way it's split up, the men are lucky if they make enough to get through the winter. I hunt on my own, or I don't hunt at all." Miller paused. Francine had returned with a quarter-filled bottle and fresh glasses, and a small glass of beer for herself. Charlie Hodge moved quickly toward the glass of whiskey she set before him. Miller took his own glass in his large, hairless hand and cupped it. Andrews took a quick sip. The liquor burned his lips and tongue and warmed his throat. He could taste nothing for the burning. "I come out here 4 years ago," Miller continued. "The same year McDonald did. My God, you should have seen this country then. In the spring, you could look out from here and see the whole land black with buffalo, solid as grass for miles. There were only a few of us then, and it was nothing for one party to get 1,000, 1,500 head in a couple of weeks hunting. Spring hides, too, pretty good fur. Now it's hunted out. They travel in smaller herds, and a man's lucky to get 200 or 300 head a trip. Another year or two, there won't be any hunting left in Kansas. Andrews took another sip of whiskey. What will you do then? Miller shrugged. I'll go back to trapping, or I'll do some mining, or I'll hunt something else. He frowned at his glass. Or I'll hunt buffalo. There are still places they can be found, if you know where to look. Around here? Andrews asked. No, Miller said. He moved his large, black-suited body restlessly in the chair and pushed his untasted drink precisely to the center of the table. In the fall of '63, I was trapping beaver up in Colorado. That was the year after Charlie here lost his hand, and he was staying in Denver and wasn't with me. The beaver was late in furring out that year, so I left my traps near the river I was working and took my mule up towards the mountains. I was hoping to get a few bears. Their skin was good that year, I had heard. I climbed all over the side of that mountain near 3 days, I guess, and wasn't able to even catch a sight of a bear. On the 4th day, I was trying to work my way higher and further north, and I come to a place where the mountain dropped off sharp into a little gorge. I thought maybe there might be a side stream down there where the animals watered, so I worked my way down. Took me the best part of a day. There wasn't no stream down there. There was a flat bed of bare ground, 10, 12 foot wide, packed hard as rock, that looked like a road cut right through the mountain. As soon as I saw it, I knew what it was, but I couldn't believe what I saw. It was a buffalo. They had trumped the earth down hard, going this way and coming back for years. I followed the bed up the mountain the rest of that day, and near nightfall, come out on a valley bed, flat as a lake. That valley wound in and out of the mountains as far as you could see, and there was buffalo scattered all over it, in little herds as far as a man could see. Fall fur, but thicker and better than winter fur on the plains grazes. From where I stood, I figured maybe 3,000-4,000 head, and there was more around the bends of the valley I couldn't see. He took the glass from the center of the table and gulped quickly, shuddering slightly as he swallowed. I had the feeling no man had ever been in that valley before, maybe some Indians a long time ago, but no man. I stayed around 2 days and never saw a human sign, and never saw one coming back out. Back near the river, the trail curved out against the side of the mountain and was hid by trees. Working up the river, a man would never see it. Andrews cleared his throat. When he spoke, his voice sounded strange and hollow to himself. Did you ever go back there? Miller shook his head. I never went back. I knew it would keep. A man couldn't find it unless he knew where it was or unless he stumbled on it accidental like I did. And that ain't very likely. 10 years, Andrew said. Why haven't you gone back? Miller shrugged. Things ain't been right for it. 1 year Charlie was laid up with the fever. Another year I was promised to something else. Another I didn't have a stake. Mainly, I haven't been able to get together the right kind of party. What kind do you need? Andrews asked. Miller did not look at him. The kind that'll let it be my hunt. There ain't many places like this left, and I never wanted any of the other hunters along. Andrews felt an obscure excitement growing within him. How many men would it take for a party like this? That would depend, Miller said, on who was getting it up. 5, 6, 7 men in most parties. Myself, on this hunt, I'd keep it small. 1 hunter would be enough, because he'd have all the time he needed to make his kill. He could keep the buffalo in the valley all the time he needs. A couple of skinners and a camp man. 4 men ought to be able to do the job about right. And the fewer the men, the bigger the take will be. Andrews did not speak. On the edge of his sight, Francine moved forward and put her elbows on the table. Charlie Hodge took a deep, sharp breath and coughed gently. After a long while, Andrews said, Could you get up a party this late in the year? Miller nodded and looked over Andrew's head. Could be done, I suppose. There was a silence. Andrew said, How much money would it take? Miller's eyes lowered and met Andrew's. He smiled slightly. Are you just talking, son, or have you got yourself interested in something? I've got myself interested, Andrew said. How much money would it take? Well now, Miller said, I hadn't thought serious about going out this year. He drummed his heavy pale fingers on the tabletop. But I suppose I could think about it now. Charlie Hodge coughed again and added an inch of whiskey to his half-filled glass. My stake's pretty low, Miller said. Whoever came in would have to put up just about all the money. How much? Andrews said. And even so, Miller continued, he'd have to understand that it would still be my hunt. He'd have to understand that. Yes, Andrew said. How much would it take? How much money you got, son? Miller asked gently. A little over $1,400, Andrews said. You'd want to go along, of course. Andrews hesitated, then he nodded. To work, I mean, to help with the skinning. Andrews nodded again. It would still be my hunt, you understand, Miller said. Andrews said, I understand. Well, it might be arranged, Miller said, if you wanted to put up the money for the team and provisions. What would we need? Andrews asked. We'd need a wagon and a team, Miller said slowly. Most often the team is mules, but a mule needs grain. A team of oxen could live off the land, going and coming, and they pull a heavy enough load. They're slow, but we wouldn't be in a great hurry. You got a horse? No, Andrews said. We'd need a horse for you, and maybe for the skinner, whoever he is. You shoot a gun? Do you mean a pistol? Miller smiled tightly. No man in his right mind has any use for them little things, he said, unless he wants to get killed. I mean a rifle. No, Andrews said. We ought to get you a small rifle. I'll need powder and lead, say a ton of lead and 500 pounds of powder. If we don't use it all, we can get refunds. In the mountains, we can live off the land, but we have to have food going and coming back. A couple of sacks of flour, 10 pounds of coffee, 20 of sugar, a couple pounds of salt, a few sides of bacon, 20 pounds of beans. We'll need some kettles and a few tools, a little grain for the horses. I'd say $500 or $600 would do it easy. That's nearly half of all the money I have, Andrew said. Miller shrugged. It's a lot of money, but you stand to make a lot more. With a good wagon, we ought to be able to load in close to 1,000 skins. They should bring us near $2,500. If there's a big kill, we can let some of the hides winter over and go back in the spring and get them. I'll take 60% and you get 40%. I'm taking a bit more than usual, but it's my hunt. And besides, I take care of Charlie here. You'll take care of the other skinner. When we get back, you should be able to sell the team and wagon for about what you paid for it. So you'll make out all right. I ain't going, Charlie Hodge said. That's the country of the devil. Miller said pleasantly. Charlie lost that hand up in the Rockies. He ain't liked the country since. Hell, fire, and ice, Charlie Hodge said. It ain't for human man. Tell Mr. Andrews about losing your hand, Charlie, Miller said. Charlie Hodge grinned through his short, grizzled beard. He put the stump of his hand on the table and inched it toward Andrews as he spoke. Miller and I was hunting and trapping early one winter in Colorado. We was up on a little rise just before the mountains when a blizzard come up. Miller and I got separated, and I slipped on a rock and hit my head and got knocked clean out of my senses. Don't know how long I laid there. When I come to, the blizzard was still blowing, and I could hear Miller calling. I've been looking for Charlie nearly 4 hours, Miller said. I must have knocked a glove off when I fell, Charlie Hodge continued, because my hand was bare and it was froze stiff, but it wasn't cold. It just kind of tingled. I yelled at Miller, and he come over and he found us a shelter back in some rocks. There was even some dry logs, and we was able to keep a fire going. I looked at that hand, and it was blue, a real bright blue. I never seen anything like it. And then it got warmed up, and then it started to hurt. I couldn't tell whether it hurt like ice or whether it hurt like fire. And then it turned red like a piece of fancy cloth. We was there 2-3 days, and the blizzard didn't let up. And then it turned blue again, almost black. It got to stinking, Miller said, so I knew it had to come off. Charlie Hodge laughed with a wheezing, cracking voice. He kept telling me it had to come off, but I wouldn't listen to him. We argued almost half a day about it until he finally wore me down. He never would have talked me into it if I hadn't got so tired. Finally, I just lay back and told him to cut away. My God, Andrew said, his voice barely a whisper. It wasn't as bad as you might think, he said. By that time, the hurt was so bad I could just barely feel the knife. And when he hit bone, I passed out, and it wasn't bad at all then. Charlie got careless, Miller said. He shouldn't have slipped on that rock. He ain't been careless since, have you, Charlie? He laughed. I've been mighty careful since then. So you see, Miller said, why Charlie don't like the Colorado country. My God, yes, Andrew said. But he'll go with us, Miller continued. With only one hand, he's a better camp man than most. Nope, Charlie Hodge said. I ain't going, not this time. It'll be all right, Miller said. This time of year, it's almost warm up there. There won't be no snow till November. He looked at Andrews. He'll go. All we'll need is a skinner. We'll need a good one because he'll have to break you in. All right, Andrews said. When will we be leaving? We should hit the mountains about the middle of September. It'll be cool up there then, and the hide should be about right. We should leave here in about 2 weeks, then a couple of weeks to get there, a week or 10 days on the kill, and a couple of weeks back. Andrews nodded. What about the team and the supplies? I'll go into Ellsworth for those, Miller said. I know a man there who has a sound wagon, and there should be oxen for sale. I'll pick up the supplies there, too, because they'll be cheaper. I should be back in 4 or 5 days. You'll make all the arrangements, Andrew said. Yes, you leave it all to me. I'll get you a good horse and a varmint rifle, and I'll get us a skinner. Do you want the money now? Andrews asked. The corners of Miller's mouth tightened in a close smile. You don't lose any time making up your mind, do you, Mr. Andrews? No, sir, Andrews said. Francine, Miller said, we all ought to have another drink on this. Bring us all some more whiskey and bring yourself some, too. Francine looked for a moment at Miller, then at Andrews. Her eyes stayed upon Andrews as she rose and went away from the table. We can have a drink on it, Miller said, and then you can give me the money. That will close it. Andrews nodded. He looked at Charlie Hodge, and beyond him. He was drowsy with the heat and with the warm effects of the whiskey he had drunk. In his mind were fragments of Miller's talk about the mountain country to which they were going, and those fragments glittered and turned and fell softly in accidental and strange patterns. Like the loose stained bits of glass in a kaleidoscope, they augmented themselves with their turning and found light from irrelevant and accidental sources. Francine returned with another bottle and placed it in the center of the table. No one spoke. Miller lifted his glass, poised it for a moment where the light from a lantern struck it with a reddish amber glow. The others silently raised their glasses and drank, not putting the glasses down until they were empty. Andrew's eyes watered at the burning in his throat. Through the moisture, he saw Francine's face shimmering palely before him. Her own eyes were upon him, and she was smiling slightly. He blinked and looked at Miller. You got the money with you? Miller asked. Andrews nodded. He opened the lower button of his shirt and withdrew from his money belt a sheaf of bills. He counted $600 upon the scarred table and returned the other bills to his belt. And that's all there is to it, Miller said. I'll ride into Ellsworth tomorrow and pick up what we need and be back in less than a week. He shuffled through the bills, selected one, and held it out to Charlie Hodge. Here, this will keep you while I'm gone. What? Charlie Hoge asked, his voice dazed. Ain't I coming with you? I'll be busy, Miller said. This will take care of you for a week. Charlie Hoge nodded slowly and then whipped the bill out of Miller's hand, crushed it, and thrust it into his shirt pocket. Andrews pushed his chair back from the table and arose. His limbs felt stiff and reluctant to move. I believe I'll turn in if there's nothing else we need to talk about. Miller shook his head. Nothing that can't wait. I'll be pulling out early in the morning, so I won't see you till I get back, but Charlie'll be around. Good night, Andrews said. Charlie Hoge grunted and looked at him somberly. Good night, ma'am, Andrews said to Francine, and bowed slightly, awkwardly, from the shoulders. Good night, Mr. Andrews, Francine said. Good luck. Andrews turned from them and walked across the long room. It was nearly deserted, and the pools of light on the rough planked floor and the hewn tables seemed sharper, and the shadows about those pools deeper and more dense than they had been earlier. He walked through the saloon and out onto the street. The glow from the blacksmith shop had all but disappeared, and the lanterns hung on the poles in front of the livery stable had burned down so that only rims of yellow light spread from the bottoms of glass bulbs. The few horses that remained tethered in front of the saloon were still, their heads slumped down nearly between their legs. The sound of Andrew's boots upon the boardwalk was loud and echoing. He went into the street and walked across to his hotel. 4. For the first few days after Miller left Butcher's Crossing for Ellsworth, Andrew spent much of his time in his hotel room. He lay on the thin mattress of his narrow bed and gazed at the bare walls, the roughly planked floor, the flat, low ceiling. He thought of his father's house on Clarendon Street near Beacon and the River Charles. Though he had left there with his portion of an uncle's bequest less than a month before, he felt that the house in which he had been born and in which he had lived his youth was very distant in time. He could summon only the dimmest image of the tall elms that surrounded the house and of the house itself. He remembered more clearly the great dim parlor and the sofa covered with dark red velvet upon which he had lain on summer afternoons, his cheek brushed by the heavy pile, his eyes following, until they were confounded, the intricately entwined floral design carved upon the walnut frame of the sofa. As if it were important, he strained his memory. Beside the sofa there had been a large lamp with a round milk-white base encircled by a chain of painted roses, and beyond that, on the wall, neatly framed, was a series of watercolors done by a forgotten aunt during her grand tour. But the image would not stay with him. Unreal, it thinned like blown fog, and Andrews came back to himself in a raw, bare room in a crudely built frame hotel in Butcher's Crossing. From that room, he could see nearly all the town. When he discovered that he could take the gauze-covered frame out of the window, he spent many hours sitting there, his arms folded on the lower frame of the window opening, his chin resting on one forearm, gazing out upon the town. His gaze alternated between the town itself, which seemed to move in a sluggish, erratic rhythm like the pulse of some brute existence, and the surrounding country. Always when his gaze lifted from the town, it went westward, toward the river, and beyond. In the clean, early morning light, the horizon was a crisp line above which was the blue and cloudless sky. Looking at the horizon, sharply defined and with a quality of absoluteness, he thought of the times when, as a boy, he had stood on the rocky coast of Massachusetts Bay and looked eastward across the grey Atlantic until his mind was choked and dizzied at the immensity he gazed upon. Older now, he looked upon another immensity in another horizon, but his mind was filled with some of the wonder he had known as a child, as if it were an intimation of some knowledge he had long ago lost. He thought now of those early explorers who had set out upon another waste, salt and wide. He remembered hearing of the superstition that told them they would come to a sharp brink and sail over it, to fall forever from the world in space and darkness. The legends had not kept them back, he knew, but he wondered how often, in their lonely sailing, they had intimations of depthless plunge, and how often they were repeated in their dreams. Looking at the horizon, he could see the line waver in the rising heat of the day. By late afternoon, with the rising winds, the line became indistinct, merged with the sky, and to the west was a vague country whose limits and extents were undefined. And as night came upon the land, creeping from the brightness, sunk like a coal in the western haze, the little town that held him seemed to contract as the dark expanded. And he had, at moments when his eye lost a point of reference, a sensation like falling, as the sailors must have had in their dreams, in their deepest fears. But a light would flicker on the street below him, or a match would flare, or a door would open to let lantern light gleam on a passing boot, and he would again discover himself sitting before an open window in his hotel room, his muscles aching from inactivity and strain. Then he would let himself drop upon his bed and sleep in another darkness that was more familiar and more safe. Occasionally he would interrupt his wait by the window and go down into the street. There the few buildings in Butcher's Crossing broke up his view of the land, so that it no longer stretched without limit in all directions, though at odd moments he had a feeling as if he were at a great distance above the town, and even above himself, gazing down upon a miniature cluster of buildings about which crawled a number of tiny figures, and from this small centre the land stretched outward endlessly, blotched and made shapeless by the point from which it spread. But more usually he wandered upon the street, among the people who seemed to flow into and out of Butcher's Crossing, as if by the impulse of an erratic but rhythmical tide. He went up and down the street, in and out of stores, paused, and went swiftly again, adjusting his motions to those of the people he moved among. Though he sought nothing in his mingling, he had odd and curious impressions that seemed to him important, perhaps because he did not seek them. He was not aware of these impressions as they occurred to him, but in the evening, as he lay in darkness on his bed, they came back to him with the force of freshness. He had an image of men moving silently in the streets amidst a clatter of sound that was extraneous to them, that defined rather than dispersed their silence. A few of them wore guns thrust carelessly in their waistbands, though most of them went unarmed. In his image, their faces had a marked similarity. They were brown and ridged, and the eyes, lighter than the skin, had a way of looking slightly upward and beyond whatever they appeared to gaze at. And finally he had the impression that they moved naturally and without strain, in a pattern so various and complex that his mind could not grasp it, a pattern whose secret passages could not be forced or opened by the will. During Miller's absence, he spoke of his own volition to only 3 persons, Francine, Charlie Hoge, and McDonald. Once he saw Francine on the street. It was about noon, when few people were about. She was walking from Jackson's saloon toward the dry goods store, and they met at the entrance, which was directly across the street from the hotel. They exchanged greetings, and Francine asked him if he had got used to the country yet. As he replied, he noticed minute beads of sweat that stood out distinctly above her full upper lip and caught the sunlight like tiny crystals. They spoke for some moments, and an awkward silence fell between them. Francine stood solid and unmoving before him, smiling at him, her wide, pale eyes blinking slowly. At last he muttered an apology and walked away from her, up the street, as if he had some place to go. He saw her again early one morning as she descended the long stairway that came from the upper floor of Jackson's saloon. She wore a plain grey dress with the collar unbuttoned at the throat, and she came down the stairs with great care. The stairs were steep and open, so that she watched her feet as she placed them precisely at the center of the thick boards. Andrews stood on the board's sidewalk and watched her come down. She did not wear a hat, and as she came out of the shadow of the building, the morning brightness caught her loose reddish-gold hair and gave warmth to her pale face. Though she had not seen him as she came down, she looked up at him without surprise when she got to the sidewalk. "Good morning," Andrews said. She nodded and smiled. She remained facing him with one hand still on the rough wooden banister of the stair. She did not speak. "You were up early this morning," he said. "There's hardly anyone on the street." "When I get up early, I take a walk sometimes." "All alone?" She nodded. "Yes, it's good to walk alone in the morning. It's cool then. Soon it'll be winter and too cold to walk, and the hunters will be in town, and I won't be alone at all. So in the summer and fall I walk when I can in the morning." "This is a beautiful morning," Andrews said. "Yes," Francine said. "It's very cool." "Well," Andrews said doubtfully, and started to move away. "I suppose I'll leave you to your walk." Francine smiled and put her hand on his arm. "No, it's all right. You walk with me for a while. We'll talk." She took his arm, and they walked slowly up and down the street, speaking quietly, their voices distinct in the morning stillness. Andrews moved stiffly. He did not look often at the girl beside him, and he was conscious of every muscle that moved him with her. Though afterward he thought often about their walk, he could not remember anything they said. He saw Charlie Hodge more frequently. Usually their conversations were brief and perfunctory, but once, casually, in a remote connection, he mentioned that his father was a lay minister in the Unitarian Church. Charlie Hodge's eyes widened, his mouth dropped incredulously, and his voice took on a new note of respect. He explained to Andrews that he had been saved by a traveling preacher in Kansas City and had been given a Bible by that same man. He showed Andrews the Bible. It was a cheap edition, worn, with several pages torn. A deep brownish stain covered the corners of a number of the pages. Charlie explained that this was blood, buffalo blood, that he had got on the Bible just a few years ago. He wondered if he had committed, even by accident, a sacrilege. Andrews assured him that he had not. Thereafter, Charlie Hodge was eager to talk. Sometimes he even went to the effort of seeking Andrews out to discuss with him some point of fact or question of interpretation about the Bible. Soon, almost to his surprise, it occurred to Andrews that he did not know the Bible well enough to talk about it even on Charlie Hodge's terms, had not in fact ever read it with any degree of thoroughness. His father had encouraged his reading of Mr. Emerson, but had not, to his recollection, insisted that he read the Bible. Somewhat reluctantly, he explained this to Charlie Hodge. Charlie Hodge's eyes became lidded with suspicion, and when he spoke to Andrews again, it was in the tone of evangelicism rather than equality. As he listened to Charlie Hodge's exhortations, his mind wandered away from the impassioned words. He thought of the times, short months before, when he had been compelled to be present each morning at 8 at King's Chapel in Harvard College to listen to words much like the words to which he listened now. It amused him to compare the crude barroom that smelled of kerosene, liquor, and sweat to the austere, dark length of King's Chapel, where hundreds of soberly dressed young men gathered each morning to hear the mumbled word of God. Listening to Charlie Hodge, thinking of King's Chapel, he realized quite suddenly that it was some irony such as this that had driven him from Harvard College, from Boston, and thrust him into this strange world where he felt unaccountably at home. Sometimes, after listening to the droning voices in the chapel and in the classrooms, he had fled the confines of Cambridge to the fields and woods that lay southwestward to it. There, in some small solitude, standing on bare ground, he felt his head bathed by the clean air and uplifted into infinite space. The meanness and the constriction he had felt were dissipated in the wildness about him. A phrase from a lecture by Mr. Emerson that he had attended came to him. "I became a transparent eyeball." Gathered in by field and wood, he was nothing. He saw all. The current of some nameless force circulated through him, and in a way that he could not feel in King's Chapel, in the college rooms, or on the Cambridge streets. He was a part and parcel of God, free and uncontained. Through the trees and across the rolling landscape, he had been able to see a hint of the distant horizon to the west, and there, for an instant, he had beheld somewhat as beautiful as his own undiscovered nature. Now, on the flat prairie around Butcher's Crossing, he regularly wandered, as if seeking a chapel more to his liking than King's or Jackson's Saloon. On one such sojourn, on the 5th day after Miller had left Butcher's Crossing, and on the day before he returned, Andrews went for the second time down the narrow rutted road toward the river, and on an impulse turned off the road onto the path that led to McDonald's shack. Andrews walked through the doorway without knocking. McDonald was seated behind his littered desk. He did not move as Andrews came into the room. "Well," McDonald said, and cleared his throat angrily. "I see you've come back." "Yes, sir," Andrews said. "I promised I would tell you if—" McDonald waved his hand impatiently. "Don't tell me," he said. "I already know. Pull up a chair." Andrews got a chair from the corner of the room and brought it up beside the desk. "You know?" McDonald laughed shortly. "Hell, yes, I know. Everybody in town knows. You gave Miller $600, and you're off on a big hunt. Up in Colorado, they say." "You even know where we're going?" Andrews said. McDonald laughed again. "You don't think you're the first one that Miller has tried to get in on this deal, do you? He's been trying for 4 years, maybe more, ever since I've known him anyway. By this time, I thought he'd have stopped." Andrews was silent for a moment. Finally, he said, "It doesn't make any difference." "You'll lose your tail, boy. Miller saw them buffalo, if he saw them at all, 10, 11 years ago. There's been a lot of hunting since then, and the herds have scattered. They don't all go where they used to go. You might find a few old strays, but that's all. You won't get your money back." Andrews shrugged. "It's a chance. Maybe I won't." "You could still back out," McDonald said. "Look." He leaned across the table and pointed a stiff index finger at Andrews. "You back out. Miller will be mad, but he won't make trouble. You can get $400 or $500 back on the stuff you've laid out for. Hell, I'll buy it from you. And if you really want to go out on the hunt, I'll fix you up. I'll send you out on one of my parties from here. You won't be gone more than 3 or 4 days, and you'll make more off those 3 or 4 days than you will off the whole trip with Miller." Andrews shook his head. "I've given my word. But it's kind of you, Mr. McDonald. I thank you very much." "Well," McDonald said after a moment, "I didn't think you'd back out. Too stubborn. Knew it when I first saw you. But it's your money, none of my business." They were silent for a long while. Andrew said at last, "Well, I wanted to see you before I left. Miller will be coming back tomorrow or the next day, and I won't know when we'll take off from here." He got up from the chair and put it back in its corner. "One thing," McDonald said, not looking at him. "That's rough country you're going up into. You do what Miller tells you. He may be a son of a bitch, but he knows the country. You listen to him, and don't go thinking you know anything at all." Andrews nodded. "Yes, sir." He went forward until his thighs pressed against McDonald's desk, and he was bent a little above McDonald's disheveled face. "I hope you do not think I am ungrateful in this matter. I know that you are a kind man, and that you have my best interests in mind. I am truly indebted to you." McDonald's mouth had slowly opened, and now it hung incredulously wide, and his round eyes were watching Andrews. Andrews turned from him and walked out of the little shack into the sunlight. In the sunlight, he paused. He wondered if he wished to go back to the town just now. Unable to decide, he let his feet carry him vaguely along the wagon tracks to the main road. There he hesitated for a moment, to turn first one way and another, as the needle of a compass, slow to settle, discovers its point. He believed, and had believed for a long time, that there was a subtle magnetism in nature, which, if he unconsciously yielded to it, would direct him aright, not indifferent to the way he walked. But he felt that only during the few days that he had been in Butcher's Crossing had nature been so purely presented to him that its power of compulsion was sufficiently strong to strike through his will, his habit, and his idea. He turned west, his back towards Butcher's Crossing, and the towns and cities that lay eastward beyond it. He walked past the clump of cottonwoods toward the river he had not seen, but which had assumed in his mind the proportions of a vast boundary that lay between himself and the wildness and freedom that his instinct sought. The mounded banks of the river rose abruptly up, though the road ascended less steeply in a gradual cut. Andrews left the road and went into the prairie grass, which whipped about his ankles and worked beneath his trouser legs and clung to his skin. He paused atop the mound and looked down at the river. It was a thin, muddy trickle over flat rocks where the road crossed it, but above and below the road deeper pools lay flat and greenish-brown in the sun. He turned his body a little to the left so that he could no longer see the road that led back to Butcher's Crossing. Looking out at the flat, featureless land into which he seemed to flow and merge, even though he stood without moving, he realized that the hunt that he had arranged with Miller was only a stratagem, a ruse upon himself, a palliative for ingrained custom and use. No business led him where he looked, where he would go. He went there free. He went free upon the plain in the western horizon, which seemed to stretch without interruption toward the setting sun, and he could not believe that there were towns and cities in it of enough consequence to disturb him. He felt that wherever he lived, and wherever he would live hereafter, he was leaving the city more and more, withdrawing into the wilderness. He felt that was the central meaning he could find in all his life, and it seemed to him then that all the events of his childhood and his youth had led him unknowingly to this moment upon which he poised, as if before flight. He looked at the river again. On this side is the city, he thought, and on that the wilderness. And though I must return, even that return is only another means I have of leaving it, more and more. He turned. Butcher's Crossing lay small and unreal before him. He walked slowly back toward the town, on the road, his feet scuffing in the dust, his eyes watching the puffs of dust that his feet went beyond. 5. Late on the 6th day following his departure from Butcher's Crossing, Miller returned. In his room, Andrews heard shouts on the street below him and heard the thump of heavy feet. Above these sounds, muffled by the distance, came the crack of a whip and the deep-throated howl of a driver. Andrews came to his feet and strode to the window. He leaned out over the ledge and looked toward the eastern approach to the town. A great cloud of dust hung upon the air, moved forward, and dissipated itself in its forward movement. Out of the dust plodded a long line of oxen. The heads of the lead team were thrust downward, and the two beasts towed in toward each other, so that occasionally their long, curving horns clashed, causing both beasts to shake their heads and snort, and separate for a few moments. Until the team got very near the town, the lead oxen passing Joe Long's barber shop, the wagon was scarcely visible to the townspeople who stood about the sidewalks, and to Will Andrews, who waited above them. The wagon was long and shallow, and it curved downward toward the center so that it gave the fleeting appearance of a flat-bottomed boat supported by massive wheels. Faded blue paint flecked the sides of the wagon, and the vestiges of red paint could be seen on the slow-turning spokes near the centers of the scarred, massive wheels. A heavy man in a check shirt sat high and erect on a wagon box seat clipped near the front. In his right hand was a long bullwhip which he cracked above the ears of the lead team. His left hand pulled heavily against an upright handbrake so that the oxen, which moved forward under his whip, were restrained by the heavy weight of the wagon above its half-locked wheels. Beside the wagon, slouched in his saddle, Miller rode a black horse. He led another, a sorrel, which was saddled but riderless. The procession passed the hotel and past Jackson's saloon. Andrews watched it go beyond the livery stable, beyond the blacksmith shop, and out of town. He watched until he could see little but the moving cloud of dust made brilliant and impenetrable by the light of the falling sun, and he waited until the dust cloud stopped and thinned away down in the hollow of the river. Then he went back to his bed and lay upon it, his palms folded beneath the back of his head, and stared up at the ceiling. He was still staring at the ceiling, at the random flickerings of light upon it, an hour later, when Charlie Hodge knocked at his door and entered without waiting for a reply. He paused just inside the room. His figure was shadowy and vague, enlarged by the dim light that came from the hall. "What are you laying here in the dark for?" he asked. "Waiting for you to come up and get me," Andrew said. He lifted his legs over the side of the bed and sat upright on its edge. "I'll light the lamp," Charlie Hodge said. He moved forward in the darkness. "Where is it?" "On the table near the window." He pulled a match across the wall beside the window. The match flared yellow. With the hand that held the match, he lifted the smoked chimney from the lamp, set it down on the table, touched the match to the wick, and replaced the chimney. The room brightened as the wick's burning grew steadier, and the flickerings from the out-of-doors were submerged. Charlie Hodge dropped the burnt match to the floor. "I guess you know Miller's back in town?" Andrews nodded. "I saw the wagon as it came past." "Who was with him?" "Fred Schneider," Charlie Hodge said. "He's gonna be our Skinner. Miller's worked with him before." Andrews nodded again. "I suppose Miller got everything he needed." "Everything's ready," Charlie Hodge said. "Miller and Schneider are at Jackson's. Miller wants you to come over so we can get everything settled." "All right," Andrews said. "I'll get my coat." "Your coat?" Charlie Hodge asked. "Boy, if you're cold now, what are you going to do when we get up in the mountains?" Andrews smiled. "I'm not cold. I'm just in the habit of wearing it." "A man loses lots of habits in time," Charlie Hodge said. "Come on, let's go." The two men left the room and went down the stairs. Charlie Hodge went a few steps in front of Andrews, who had to hurry to keep up with him. He walked with quick, nervous strides, and his thin, drawn-in shoulders jerked upward with his steps. Miller and Schneider were waiting at the long, narrow bar at Jackson's. They stood at the bar with glasses of beer in front of them. A light mantle of dust clung about the shoulders of Schneider's red-checked shirt, and the ends of his straight, bristling brown hair, visible beneath a flat-brimmed hat, were caked white with trail dust. The two men turned as Charlie Hodge and Will Andrews came down the room toward them. Miller's flat, thin lips curved upward in a tight smile. A precise swathe of black beard shadowed the heavy lower half of his face. "Will," he said softly, "did you think I wasn't coming back?" Andrews smiled. "No, I knew you'd be back." "Will, this is Fred Schneider. He's our Skinner." Andrews extended his hand, and Schneider took it. Schneider's hand clasp was loose, indifferent. He shook Andrews' hand once with a quick pumping motion. "How do?" he said. His face was round, and though the lower part was covered with a light brown stubble, the whole face gave the appearance of being smooth and featureless. His eyes were wide and blue, and they regarded Andrews from beneath heavy, sleepy lids. He was a man of medium height, thickly built. He gave the immediate impression of being at all times watchful, alert, and on his guard. He wore a small pistol in a black leather holster hung high on his waist. Miller drained the last of his beer from his glass. "Let's go in the big room where we can sit down," he said, wiping a bit of foam from his lips with a forefinger. The others nodded. Schneider stood aside and waited for them to pass through the side door. Then he followed, closing the door carefully behind them. The group of 4 men, with Miller in the lead, went toward the back of the room. They took a table near the stairs. Schneider sat with his back to the stairs, facing the room. Andrews sat in front of him. Charlie Hodge was at Andrews' left, and Miller was at his right. Miller said, "On my way back from the river, I stopped in and saw McDonald. He'll buy our hides from us. That'll save us packing to Ellsworth." "How much will he pay?" asked Schneider. $4 apiece for prime hides," Miller said. "He's got a buyer for prime hides back east." Schneider shook his head. "How much for summer hides? You won't find any prime skins for another 3 months." Miller turned to Andrews. I haven't made any arrangements with Schneider, and I haven't told him where we're going. I thought I ought to wait till we all got together. Andrews nodded. All right, he said. Let's have a drink while we talk, Miller said. Charlie, see if you can find somebody to bring us back a pitcher of beer and some whiskey. Charlie Hoge scraped his chair back on the floor and went swiftly across the room. Did you make out all right at Ellsworth? Andrews asked. Miller nodded. Got a good buy on the wagon. Some of the oxen haven't been broken in, and a couple of them need to be shod, but the lead team is a good one, and the rest of them will be broken in after the first few days. Did you have enough money? Miller nodded again indifferently. Got a little left over, even. I found you a nice horse. I rode it all the way back. All we need to pick up here is some whiskey for Charlie, a few sides of bacon, and do you have any rough clothes? I can pick some up tomorrow, Andrews said. I'll tell you what you need. Schneider looked sleepily at the two men. Where are we going? Charlie Hoge came across the room behind him, carrying a tray with a pitcher, bottle, and glasses upon it. Francine weaved among the tables. Charlie Hoge sat down, and Francine put the bottle of whiskey and the pitcher of beer in the center of the table and put the glasses in front of the men. She smiled at Andrews and turned to Miller. Did you bring me what I asked for from Ellsworth? Yep, Miller said. I'll give it to you later. You sit at another table for a while, Francine. We got business to talk over. Francine nodded and walked to a table where another girl and a man was sitting. Andrews watched her until she sat down. When he turned, he saw that Schneider's eyes were still upon her. Schneider blinked slowly once and turned his eyes to Andrews. Andrews looked away. All of the men except Charlie Hoge filled their glasses with beer. He took the bottle of whiskey before him, uncorked it, and let the pale amber liquor gurgle into his glass nearly to the brim. Where are we going? Schneider asked again. Miller set his glass of beer to his lips and drank in long, even swallows. He put the glass on the table and turned it with his heavy fingers. We're going to the mountain country, Miller said. This mountain country, Schneider said. He put his glass on the table as if the taste of the beer had suddenly become unpleasant. Up in Colorado territory. That's right, Miller said. You know the country. I know it, Schneider said. He nodded for several moments without speaking. Well, I guess I ain't lost much time. I can get a good night's sleep and start back for Ellsworth early tomorrow morning. Miller did not speak. He took his glass up and finished his beer, and sighed deeply. Why in the hell do you figure to go clear across the country? Schneider asked. You can find plenty of buffalo 30-40 miles from here. Summer hides, Miller said. Thin as paper and just about as strong. Schneider snorted. What the hell do you care? You can get good money for them. Fred, Miller said, we've worked together before. I wouldn't lead you into something that wasn't good. I got a herd staked out. Nobody knows anything about it except me. We can get back 1,000 hides easy, maybe more. You heard McDonald. $4 apiece for prime hides. That's $4,000. $600 for your share, maybe more. That's a damn sight better than you'll do anywhere else around here. Schneider nodded. If there's buffalo where you say there is, how long has it been since you've seen this herd? It's been some time, Miller said, but that don't worry me. It worries me, said Schneider. I know for a fact you ain't been in the mountain country for 8-9 years, maybe longer. Charlie's going, Miller said, and Mr. Andrews here is going. He even put up the money. Charlie will do anything you tell him to, Schneider said, and I don't know Mr. Andrews. I won't argue with you, Fred. Miller poured himself another glass of beer, but it seems like you're letting me down. You can find another Skinner who ain't got as much sense as I have. You're the best there is, Miller said, and for this trip, I wanted the best. Hell, Schneider said. He reached for the pitcher of beer. It was almost empty. He held it up and called to Francine. Francine got up from the table where she was sitting, took the pitcher, and left without speaking. Schneider took the bottle of whiskey from in front of Charlie Hoge and poured several fingers of it into his beer glass. He drank it in 2 gulps, grimacing at the burning. It's too much of a gamble, he said. We'd be gone 2 months, maybe 3, and we might have nothing to show for it. It's been a long time since you've seen them buffalo. A country can change in 8 or 9 years. We won't be gone for more than a month and a half, or 2 months, Miller said. I got fresh young oxen. They should make near 30 miles a day going, and maybe 20 coming back. They might make 15 going and 10 coming, if you push them right hard. The days are long this time of year, Miller said. The country's nearly level right up to where we're going, and there's water all along the way. Hell, Schneider said. Miller did not speak. All right, Schneider said. I'll go, but no shares. I'm taking no chances. I'll take $60 a month straight, starting the day we leave here and ending the day we get back. That's $15 more than usual, Miller said. You said I was the best, Schneider said, and you offered shares. Besides, that's rough country where you intend to go. Miller looked at Andrews. Andrews nodded. Done, Miller said. Where's that gal with the beer? Schneider asked. Charlie Hodge took the bottle of whiskey from in front of Schneider and replenished his glass. He sipped the liquor delicately, appreciatively. His small grey eyes darted between Miller and Schneider. He grinned sharply, craftily at Schneider and said, I knowed all along you give in. I knowed it from the first. Schneider nodded. Miller always gets what he's after. They were silent. Francine came across the room with their pitcher of beer and set it on the table. She smiled briefly at the group and spoke again to Miller. You about finished with your business? Almost, Miller said. I left your package in the front room under the bar. Why don't you run out and see if it's what you wanted? Maybe you can come back a little later and have a drink with us. Francine said, all right, and started to move away. As she moved, Schneider put out a hand and laid it on her arm. Andrews stiffened. Sprechen Sie Deutsch? He asked. He was grinning. Yes, she said. Ach, he said, ich so glaube, du arbeitest jetzt nicht wahr? Nein, Francine said. Ja, Schneider said, still grinning. Du arbeitest mit mir, nicht wahr? All right, Miller said. We've got things to talk about. Go on now, Francine. Francine moved away from Schneider's hand and went quickly across the room. What was that all about? Asked Andrews. His voice was tight. Why, I just asked her if she wanted a little job of work, Schneider said. I ain't seen a better-looking whore since I was in St. Louis. Andrews looked at him for a moment. His lips tingled with anger, and his hands, beneath the table, were tightly clasped. He turned to Miller. When do we figure on leaving? 3 or 4 days, Miller said. He looked from Andrews to Schneider with faint amusement. The wagon needs a little work, and like I said, a couple of the oxen need to be shod. Nothing's going to hold us up. Schneider poured himself a glass of beer. You said there was water all the way. What route do we take? Miller smiled. Don't worry about that. I have that all figured out. I've thought it over in my mind for a long time. All right, Schneider said. Do I work alone? Mr. Andrews will help you. He ever done any skinning before? He looked at Andrews, grinning again. No, Andrews said shortly. His face grew warmer. I'd feel better about it if I worked with somebody I knew better, Schneider said. No offense. I think you'll find that Mr. Andrews will be a lot of help, Fred. Miller's voice was gentle, and he did not look at Schneider. All right, Schneider said. You're the boss, but I ain't got any extra knives. All of that's taken care of, Miller said. All we need is to get Will some work clothes. We can do that tomorrow. You've got it all figured out, haven't you? Schneider spoke indifferently. The sleepy look had come back into his pale eyes. Miller nodded. Andrews finished the last dregs of his warm beer. I take it, then, that there's nothing else we have to talk about tonight? Nothing that won't keep, Miller said. Then I think I'll go back to the hotel. I have a few letters I ought to write. All right, Will, Miller said, but we ought to get those clothes tomorrow. Why don't you meet me at the dry goods store just after noon? Andrews nodded. He said good night to Charlie Hodge and laid a bill on the table. I'd be obliged if you'd all have another drink on me. He walked across the room, through the door into the smoky bar, and quickly onto the street. The anger which had risen within him back in the room, listening to Schneider talk to Francine, began to subside. A light breeze came in from the river and carried with it the odor of manure and the acrid smell of heated, impure metal from the blacksmith shop across the street from him. A red glow from the shop filtered through the yellow light of a lantern hung within the doorway. The soft whoosh of bellows working could be heard among the clangs of metal on hot metal. He breathed deeply of the cooling night air and started off the board sidewalk to cross the street to his hotel. But he halted, with one foot in the dust of the street and the other still resting on the edge of a thick plank. He had heard, or thought he had heard, his name whispered behind him somewhere in the darkness. He turned uncertainly and heard more distinctly the voice that called to him. "Mr. Andrews, over here." The whispered voice seemed to come from one corner of the long saloon building. He went toward it, his way lighted by the irregular glow that came from the half door and the small high windows of Jackson's saloon. It was Francine. Though he had not expected to see her, he looked at her without surprise. She stood on the first step of the long, steep stairway that led up the side of the building. Her face was made pale and vague by the darkness, and her body was a dark shadow in the darkness around her. She reached out her hand and laid it on his shoulder. On the step, she stood above him and looked down at him when she spoke. "I thought that was you. I've been waiting here for you to come out." Andrew's voice came with difficulty. I got tired of talking to them. I needed some fresh air." She smiled and drew back a little, her hand still light on his shoulder. Her face fell into shadow, and he could see only her eyes and her teeth, revealed by her smiling in the reflection of dim light. "Come upstairs with me," she said softly. "Come up for a while." He swallowed and tried to speak. "Come on," she said. "It'll be all right." She exerted a gentle pressure on his shoulder and turned away from him. He heard the rustle of her clothes as she started up the stairs. He followed, groping for the rough handrail on his left, his eyes desperately trying to make out the shape that went softly and slowly above him, pulling him with her invisibly. They paused at the small square landing at the top of the stairs. She stood in the dark shade of the doorway, fumbling with the latch. For an instant, Andrews looked out over Butcher's Crossing. What he could see of the town was a dark, irregular shadow like a blotch upon the glimmer of the plain. The thin edge of a new moon hung in the west. The door creaked open. Francine whispered something, and he followed her into the darkness of the doorway. A small dim light burned in the distance. Its illumination was thin and local, but he could make out that they were in a narrow hall. The muffled sounds of men's voices and the clump of boots on wood came from below. He realized that they were just above the large hall beside Jackson's saloon, out of which he had walked a few moments before. He groped forward, and his hands touched the smooth, stiff material of Francine's dress. "Here," she whispered. She found his hand and took it. Her hand felt cool and moist to his own. "Down this way." He went blindly after her, his feet sliding and catching on the rough boards of the floor. They stopped. Dimly he made out a doorway. Francine opened the door, saying, "This is my room," and went in. Andrews followed, blinking against the light that came when the door was open. Inside the room, he closed the door and leaned against it, his eyes following Francine, who moved across the small room to a table, upon which a lamp, its base milk-white and decorated with brightly painted roses, burned dimly. She turned the lamp up so that the room was more brightly illumined. The light revealed the smallness of the room, the neatly made iron bedstead, a small curving sofa whose wooden frame was carved with twinned flowers, and upon which were cushions covered with dark red velvet. The walls of the room were newly papered. Upon them hung several framed engravings of woodland scenes. Here and there on the walls the brightly flowered wallpaper curled and peeled, revealing naked wood. Though he did not know what he had expected, Andrews was taken aback and made slightly uncomfortable by the familiarity of the room. For a moment he did not move. Francine, her back to the light, was smiling. Again he was aware of the light glinting from her eyes and teeth. She motioned to the couch. Andrews nodded and went across the floor. When he sat down, he looked at his feet. There was a thin carpet, worn and stained, over the floor. Francine came across the room from the table beside the bed and sat on the couch beside him. She sat a little sideways so that she was facing him. Her back was straight, and she looked almost prim there in the lamplight, with her hands folded in her lap. You have a nice place here," Andrew said. She nodded. "I have the only carpet in town," she said. "I had it sent from St. Louis. Pretty soon I'm going to get a glass window. The dust blows in, and it's hard to keep a place clean." Andrews nodded and smiled. He drummed his fingers on his knees. "Have you been here long, in Butcher's Crossing?" 2 years, she said indifferently. "I was in St. Louis before that, but there were too many girls there. I didn't like it." Her eyes were upon him as if she had no interest in what she was saying. "I like it here. I can rest in the summer, and there aren't so many people." He spoke to her, but he hardly knew what he said, for as he spoke, his heart went out to her in an excess of pity. He saw her as a poor, ignorant victim of her time and place, betrayed by certain artificialities of conduct, thrust from a great mechanical world upon this bare plateau of existence that fronted the wilderness. He thought of Schneider, who had caught her arm and spoken coarsely to her, and he imagined vaguely the humiliations she had schooled herself to endure. A revulsion against the world rose up within him, and he could taste it in his throat. Impulsively, he reached across the sofa and took her hand. "It must be a terrible life for you," he said suddenly. "Terrible?" She frowned thoughtfully. "No, it's better than St. Louis. The men are better. There aren't so many girls." "You have no family, no one you can go to." She laughed. "What would I do with a family?" She squeezed his hand and raised it and turned it palm upward. "So soft," she said. She caressed his palm with her thumb, which moved slowly and rhythmically in small circles. "That's the only thing I don't like about the men here. Their hands are so rough." He was trembling. With his free hand, he grasped the armrest of the sofa and held it tightly. "What do they call you?" Francine asked softly. "Is it William?" "Will," Andrew said. "I'll call you William," she said. "It's more like you, I think." She smiled slowly at him. "You're very young, I think." He removed his hand from the smooth caress of her fingers. "I am 23. She came closer to him, sliding across the sofa. The rustle of her stiff, smooth dress sounded like soft cloth tearing. Her shoulder lightly pressed against his shoulder, and she breathed gently, evenly. "Don't be angry," she said. "I'm glad you're young. I want you to be young. All of the men here are old and hard. I want you to be soft, while you can be. When will you go with Miller and the others?" 3 or 4 days, Andrew said, "but we will be back within the month, and then—" Francine shook her head, though she continued smiling. "Yes, you'll be back, but you won't be the same. You'll not be so young. You will become like the others." Andrew looked at her confusedly, and in his confusion cried, "I will only become myself." She continued as if he had not interrupted. "The wind and the sun will harden your face. Your hands will no longer be soft." Andrews opened his mouth to reply. He had become vaguely angry at her words. But he did not speak his anger, and as he looked at her in the lamplight, his anger died. There was a simplicity and earnestness, a sweet but not profound sorrow in her expression, which disarmed him, and which raised a tenderness with the pity he had felt a moment earlier. At that instant it seemed to him incredible that she could be what her profession termed her. He extended the hand that he had withdrawn, and covered her hand. "You are," he began, and hesitated, and began again. "You are," but he could not finish. He did not know what he wanted to say. "But for a little while," Francine said. "You will be here. For 3 or 4 days you will be young and soft." "Yes," Andrew said. "You will stay here for these days," Francine said softly. She ran her fingertips lightly over the back of his hand. "You will make love to me." He did not speak. He was aware of her fingers moving upon his hand, and he concentrated upon that sensation. "I'm not working now," Francine said quickly. "It's for love. It's because I want you." He shook his head numbly, not in refusal, but in despair. "Francine, I know," she said softly, smiling again. "You have not had a woman before, have you?" He did not speak. "Have you?" He remembered several abortive experiments with a younger cousin of his, a small petulant girl, some years before. He remembered his urgency, his embarrassment, and his eventual boredom. And he remembered his father's averted face and vague words after the visiting parents of the girl left their home. "No," he said. "It's all right," Francine said. "I'll show you, here." She stood up and extended her hands down to him. He grasped them and stood up before her. She came close to him, almost touching him. He felt her soft stomach come against him. His muscles contracted, and he flinched slightly away. "It's all right," Francine said, her breath warm against his ear. "Don't think of anything." She laughed softly. "Are you all right?" "Yes," he said shakily. She pulled away from him a little and looked at his face. It seemed to him that her lips had grown thicker and that her eyes had darkened. She moved her body against him. "I wanted you the first time I saw you," she said, "without you even touching me or talking to me." She moved away, her eyes still dark upon him. She reached her arms up behind her neck and began unsnapping her dress. He watched her numbly, his arms held awkwardly at his sides. Suddenly she shook her body and the dress fell in a grey heap at her feet. She was nude. Her body gleamed in the lamplight. Delicately she stepped out of the dress, and her flesh quivered with the movement. Her heavy breasts swung slowly as she walked towards him. "Now," she said, and lifted her lips up to him. He kissed her with dry lips, tasting wetness. She whispered against his lips, and her hands fumbled with his shirt front. He felt her hands go inside his shirt, go lightly over the tensed muscles of his chest. "Now," she said again. It was a bruised sound, and it seemed to echo in his head. He pulled away from her a little to look at her soft, heavy body that clung to him like velvet, held there of its own nature. There was a serenity on her face, almost as if it were asleep, and he felt that she was beautiful. But suddenly there came into his mind the words that Schneider had used back in the saloon. He had said that he hadn't seen a better-looking whore since he had left St. Louis, and the look of her face changed, though he could not tell in what respect. He was assailed by the knowledge that others had seen this face as he was seeing it now, that others had kissed her on her wet lips, had heard the voice he was hearing, had felt the same breath he was feeling upon his own face now. They had quickly paid their money and had gone, and others had come, and others. He had a quick and irrational image of hundreds of men steadily streaming in and out of a room. He turned, pulled away from her, suddenly dead inside. "What is it?" Francine said sleepily. "Come back." "No," he said hoarsely, and flung himself across the room, stumbling on the edge of the rug. My God, no, I'm sorry. He looked up. Francine stood dumbly in the center of the room. Her arms were held out as if to describe a shape to him. There was a look of bewilderment in her eyes. I can't, he said to her, as if he were explaining something. I can't. He looked at her once more. She did not move, and the look of bewilderment did not leave her face. He pulled open the door and let the knob fly violently from his hand. He ran into the dark hall and stumbled down its length, opened the door to the landing, and stood for a moment on the landing, breathing air in deep, famished gulps. When his legs regained some of their strength, he went down the stairs, feeling his way by the rough banister. He stood for a moment on the rough sidewalk and looked up and down the street. He could not see much of Butcher's Crossing in the darkness. He looked across the street at his hotel. A dim light came from the doorway. He went across the dusty street toward it. He did not think of Francine or of what had happened in the room above Jackson's saloon. He thought of the 3 or 4 days that he would have to wait in this place before Miller and the others were ready. He thought of how he might spend them, and he wondered how he might press them into one crumpled bit of time that he could toss away.